I'll say a couple of quick words about Vanessa. It's a real treat to have Vanessa here, I have to say, because she's one of our, not only one of our graduates in our anthropology program here, but I'd have to say one of our really exemplary graduates. She was an exemplary student when she was here, and then she's gone on to do great things. She's recently completed her MLit with distinction, which ain't easy, in archaeological studies at the University of Glasgow, with previous undergraduate degrees, as I mentioned, from St. Mary's University, anthropology, BA honors, and the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. She's been involved in archaeological projects in Nova Scotia and Scotland during her time there, and she has, as is healthy and appropriate, wide-ranging interests in archaeology, particularly researching colonial Nova Scotia, early medieval Scotland, gender, and funerary archaeology. Now, the work you're about to see tonight is the result of Vanessa's honors research here at St. Mary's in anthropology, which she has since gone on and continued to work with and deepen and broaden, and I'm hoping that one day this will actually turn into a book that I can put on my bookshelf. But for now, you're going to see, I think, something really interesting. A very capable student, a very interdisciplinary approach to an interesting question. Was Peter McNab actually trying to create a little Scotland on McNabs Island? That's the question. For an answer, I'm going to turn this over to Vanessa Smith. Please make her welcome.
Thank you, everyone. And again, thank you for your patience as we dealt with our technology. We have one final piece, plugging in the microphone, because I'm not quite as good at projecting as Jonathan there.
Let's try that.
All right, so let's roll right into it. And I want to set the tone tonight with a quotation from Thomas Riddell's Hangman's Beach. As the summers went by, the short Nova Scotia summers, McNab had a growing itch to own this pleasant retreat in the harbour mouth. Not just the beach or the cove, the whole island. He would build there a good house for himself and cottages for servants and tenants. His retainers would clear away the woods, the clearings would make pasture for sheep. Great flocks of sheep, as he had seen them grazing on the lands of gentry in Scotland. And in this delightful scene, he would wear the kilt and play the Laird in the good old Highland fashion. On Christmas Day, 1782, or so the story goes, Peter McNab purchased the largest island in Halifax Harbour and began to establish himself and his family, as well as a number of tenant farmers on the land. Folk tradition records that Peter McNab was Scottish by birth, but here the varying accounts become, well, a little bit fuzzy. Some record him as being a near relative of the clan chief of Clan McNab, hailing from the Breadalbane district in Perthshire. Others list him as arriving from Inverness in the north of Scotland. Peter McNab is variously described as a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, arriving in Halifax after serving in the siege of Louisbourg, as a coxswain to Edward Cornwallis, as a merchant, and as a simple shoemaker or cordwainer. Despite his enigmatic origins, however, the folk history of the island depicts Peter McNab as an aspiring Scottish gentleman, eager to build a community on this newly purchased island and set himself up in the role of lord, or to use the Scottish terminology, laird, with tenants recruited from his homeland to clear and farm the land. These sources suggest that, as well, that his son, Peter McNab II, closely followed in his father's footsteps, overseeing the tenants on the island and continuing the distinctly Scottish lifestyle initiated by the elder McNab. This particular vision moved further into popular perception through the novel Hangman's Beach by Thomas Riddell, as well as through other literary sources. This talk will be exploring the folk and literary traditions surrounding Peter McNab and his son, Peter II, and I'll be looking at a range of archival, cartographic, and archaeological sources. I'll be considering the settlement of McNabs Island and questioning whether Peter I and Peter II were indeed playing the Laird and establishing a community modeled after Peter's native Scotland. To do this, I considered not only the early McNab family, but what information we could find regarding the island's tenants at the same time. And I was also looking at the marks that the McNab family and these tenants collectively left on the landscape of the island. I was specifically looking at the period between roughly 1782, when Peter McNab first purchased the island, until about 1847, when Peter II dies, and we start seeing the references to a Scottish lifestyle dwindling in the record. So let's step back a little bit to establish some context. At the founding of Halifax in 1749, Edward Cornwallis was initially granted the whole of the island that we now call McNabs Island, and he soon transferred ownership to his nephews. And you can see in the early maps that the Cornwallis family give their name to the island. It's Cornwallis Island on this map. In 1773, the Cornwallis family placed the island up for sale for the quite noteworthy sum at the time of 1,000 pounds sterling. Perhaps due to that asking price, the island did remain unsold until 1782, when Peter McNab purchased the island for the full asking price. And not only did he have to pay this 1,000 pounds, which was again quite notable for the time, he was also required to pay Richard Buckley a further 313 pounds for supposed improvements to the island. And we have a letter in the archives that expresses his great ire at having to do this. As I noted earlier, Peter McNab's past prior to the purchase of the island is quite unclear, but once in Halifax, Peter McNab soon established himself as an entrepreneur and began to attain a level of status in the community. Sources suggest that prior to purchasing the island, he had initially leased a part of Cornwallis Island, as it was at the time, for a fishing business. At the same time, we have church records that would chronicle that while he arrived in Halifax as a bachelor, he soon married Susanna Kuhn in November of 1763. So collectively, these activities paint the picture of a newcomer to the area, enthusiastically and successfully putting down roots in his adopted community and ascending the social ladder from anonymous immigrant to respected citizen. So that's the foundation of what we know about Peter McNab. So adding to this, we also have a body of information that makes up the folk tradition about the man. And while this tradition is composed of various sources, a number stand out as the core documents of the tradition. And these include H.W. Hewitt's 1901 series on the island and surrounding area that was written for the Dartmouth Patriot, as well as some other local histories. And we also have a family letter dating from 1908 from Peter's great-great-granddaughter, Margaret Castles Cook, to her niece, Chelsea Castles, that recounts the family history and her recollections of her own time as a child on the island. While this is titled, this letter is called Narrative Regarding McNabs Island, I'll be referring to this as the Cook-Castles letter. I just found it a little bit briefer. A key point in this letter, the author is asserting that Peter II brought shepherds from Scotland. And this narrative then starts to reappear in other later secondary sources. For example, we have an edition of the Encyclopedia of Canada that specifically says that Peter II recruited shepherds from Scotland to tend his sheep. And other publications and newspaper articles have likely been influenced by this source and continue to reiterate this message of these shepherds coming from Scotland to tend the sheep and be tenants to Peter McNab as Laird. The Dartmouth Patriot articles also add that both Peter I and Peter II were known locally as Governor McNab to the tenants. The romantic vision of Peter McNab and Peter II as Scottish lairds on their island home moves further into the popular perception and imagination with the literary tradition, and most notably in the 1966 publication of the novel Hangman's Beach by Nova Scotia historian Thomas Riddell, which featured the McNab family prominently. And I think there's a number of people in the audience who are very fond of Hangman's Beach. Some of the themes that we see in Hangman's Beach, the passage from the book that opened this talk really characterizes Riddell's depiction of Peter McNab through the early chapters of the novel. And Riddell not only writes that the first Peter brought shepherds from Scotland, but also household servants and a bagpiper. On a number of occasions in the storyline, Riddell suggests that both Peters, father and son, as well as other members of the household, spoke Scottish Gaelic. The McNab's dialogue in the book are also written in Riddell's approximation of a Scottish dialect or brogue. The McNab menfolk, young and old, are all described as wearing traditional Scottish attire, complete with kilts, stockings, brogue shoes. And throughout the book, Riddell calls both Peter McNab and his son, Peter II, the Laird, and continuously constructs this role and attitude for both men throughout the novel. Although less well known, it's important to also mention another early literary source, the historical romance Grand Parade, written in 1943 by G.B. Lancaster. This book also depicts the McNab family, albeit they're thinly disguised with the fictional family name of Cochrane. And Grand Parade portrays the lives and loves of the Cochrane family in early colonial Halifax. The family patriarch in this book is seemingly representing either Peter I or Peter II, and is called the Laird throughout the book. And again, we find the Lancasters' Cochrane family dressed in kilts and surrounded by tenant farmers brought from Scotland. A relevant fact about G.B. Lancaster is that that name is the pen name for New Zealand author Edith Joan Littleton. Littleton is the daughter of Westcote McNab Littleton, and therefore a descendant of the McNabs through the intermarriage of the McNab and Littleton families. Her fictional characterization of her ancestors speaks to an enduring family tradition of the family's inherently Scottish nature. So in both folk and literary traditions, we find Peter McNab and his family as Highland Scots reproducing the practices, attitudes, and traditional roles of Old World Scotland in their new colonial home, complete with Scottish tenants serving their laird, tartan, bagpipers, the whole 9 yards. It's a very evocative and romantic picture, don't you think? And I think, when you look at this picture, it's important to question if there's any evidence to support this particular vision. So to do my work, I was following a number of paths to gain an understanding of what was actually going on McNabs Island during this particular period. So I was looking at archival sources. I was consulting census and poll tax records, will and probate information, property records, early newspapers, marriage documents. I also looked at Thomas Riddell's research notes from when he was writing Hangman's Beach to see what he was thinking and looking at when he was doing so. Looking at the maps from the island, cartographic and early period mapping, just to see what was going on during Peter I and Peter II's time on the island. And I also looked at the years immediately following Peter II's death. In archaeological sources, I looked at any available reports on work conducted on the island, and I made an informal survey of the area around where the original McNab homestead is thought to be on McNab's Cove. I looked at a number of paintings and prints depicting the island during the period. And as I was looking at all of these sources, I was considering, what might we see? What might playing the Laird look like on the ground if we're going to see it at all? So let's begin with the tenants. These should primarily, according to the folk tradition, be these immigrants from Scotland brought over by Peter McNab I and Peter McNab II to tend the sheep. The Cook Castle's letter and the Hewitt article for the Patriot make very specific reference to a number of Scottish individuals who we should be able to see in the historical record. Hewitt notes that Thomas Fraser, one of Peter McNab's first tenants, was a soldier who had fought at Culloden, and in 1746, after which he came to Halifax. And it does appear that this tenant was present on the island. Thomas Fraser is first officially recorded in the 1792 census and appears again in 1793, disappearing by the later census period, but there may be some of his descendants listed in the later census records. As well, we have a site called Fraser Farm, marked on the 1808 Toller map plan of the peninsula and harbor of Halifax. So this is the overall map, which is granted a little bit hard to see, but here is Fraser Farm marked on it in a little bit more detail. Another Scottish family name, McLean, appears on the same map, but they don't appear in the census recording at all. The only reference found for this family living on the island is a death certificate for O'Neill McLean of McNabs Island, with his executor, John McLean, also being listed as a resident of the island. I found this certificate particularly interesting because it identifies the deceased, Neil McLean, as a piper. So, interesting little tangent there. I think that's going to be a bit of research that I'll probably come back to. We have also tenant William Frost, who is identified in a local history as a native of Argyllshire in Scotland. And we have some baptismal and marriage records that do place him on the island between 1833 and 1840 time period. So while it does appear that he may have been a Scottish tenant on the island, he certainly is coming to the island in a bit of a later period than some of the others. Hewitt identifies John Little, who is possibly Captain John Little, as another Scottish tenant, but his name does not appear in any of the census records. And similarly, the Cook Castle's letter recalls that one of the shepherds was called MacDonald and hailed from Rossshire. But again, this family name is not found in any of the historical sources that I consulted, any of the census records, poll tax records. When we are looking at, holistically at these documents, the 1792, 1793, and 1827 census and poll tax records, we are seeing some names that could be Scottish. We have, for example, we have a John McPherson, we have a Donald McIntyre, and we have a David McGraw, for example. However, of course, there's no definitive proof that they are in fact Scottish or that they were specifically recruited by Peter McNab, either one, to come to McNabs Island and act as tenant farmers to him. In fact, contrary to what we might expect from the folk tradition, we are seeing that we have tenants from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds, not just Scottish. For example, there's the Coon family, which is represented in the census by Henry Coon Sr. and Henry Coon Jr. And this family is most likely Swiss, coming to Canada from an area around Zurich. And it's important to remember, too, that Susanna Coon, who Peter I married when he arrived in Halifax, is the daughter of this same family. Another family name, the Culletons, this was an Irish family, and they are listed as being Roman Catholic, which would seem to support this ancestry as well. And they, too, are notable because Peter II married Joanna Culleton, who is likely the sister of tenant Thomas Culleton. We find some other tenants who are identified as Irish. This would be Michael Cleary and John Cooney Sr., or Swiss, which is Andrew Hutt. Hewitt records that tenant Jacob Horn was of German origin. It's also important, I think, to understand that Peter McNab didn't purchase an unpopulated island. It wasn't a blank slate to just slot these theoretical shepherds from Scotland into. A number of the tenants seem to have been living on McNabs prior to his arrival. It also appears that a few tenant families, for example, the Frasers, the Coons, and the Culletons, remained on the island for many years and through successive generations, but the majority of the tenants seem to have occupied their properties on the island for relatively brief periods of time. And it looks like they often would leave the island to have property on the mainland, often in Eastern Passage. So we have a very mobile population. So if, in fact, Peter McNab or Peter II had recruited them to come from Scotland, their loyalty to their supposed Laird was very short-lived indeed. I also found one local history that states that in 1785, Peter McNab was advertising land for rent on the island for fishing, farming, and timbering activities, and this would seem to confirm that a portion of the tenants on the island were being drawn from the local population, not recruited from Scotland or really anywhere else. So I think we can say that notwithstanding some interesting exceptions, again thinking of Neil McLean, the piper there, the average McNab tenant was decidedly not Scottish, and nor is there any reason to believe that he or his family had been deliberately brought from Scotland by Peter McNab to serve as tenants or servants to the family. A final point that I wanted to make about the tenants as well. In the later part of the 18th century in Scotland, the model for tenancy frequently consisted of farmsteads that were being held by multiple tenants. When we look at the 1769 survey of Loch Tayside, which is an area around Loch Tay, near McNab lands in Perthshire, we find very few farms that are being held by just one single tenant. And in fact, we have many farms that are held by up to 10 unrelated tenants. In contrast, the farms of McNabs Island appear to have been held by individuals or families, not these groups of unrelated multiple tenants. Turning to the cartographic record, I located a number of maps that depict the locations of various structures, roads, pathways, farms, field boundaries, orchards, and other constructed features. And these maps I was using to give a broad sense of how the island was being used and occupied. In some cases, the names of tenants holding the land was also noted, which was wonderful, and we have seen that on the taller map that just went by a few slides ago. However, the majority of the maps dating from the period of 1782 to 1847 simply record McNabs or Cornwallis Island as a featureless geographic entity for the most part, or else they only note topography but not the human presence on the land. As well, there are significant periods for which no mapping is available, particularly from the time when Peter McNab first purchased the land until some years after his death. In an attempt to fill out the picture of the landscape, I was also extending my search into the years after Peter II had passed away to, again, get a sense of how the land was being developed. On this French map, which is undated but would seem to predate Peter McNab's purchase of the island, and we've seen this earlier, we're seeing a number of structures around the central and northern parts of the island, and this reinforces that the island was likely occupied by existing tenants when Peter McNab first purchased the island. And similarly, one version of the Atlantic Neptune mapping from 1780 shows the island apparently divided into a series of lots. And I think it's also important to point out that both on the French map and on the Atlantic Neptune mapping, these lots and these structures that they're showing don't really correspond to anything from the Peter McNab period of occupation. So there was something different going on before this period. And here's our taller map again. The 1808 taller map, plan of the peninsula and harbor of Halifax, is the first to identify the island as belonging to the McNab family. But curiously, it fails to label the original McNab homestead, although there are structures shown on the shores of McNab's Cove, which is where it's thought to be. Stranger still, as we've seen, Toller does record two other names on the map, clearly marking the farms of the tenants Fraser and McLean. And in other areas of the island, he does show buildings, but not naming their owners. I've always been curious about these choices, and I don't mean to dwell on this map unduly, but when I look at the taller map, I'm wondering why the map maker made the choices they did. Was the information unavailable or simply irrelevant to the map maker? And conversely, were the Fraser and McLean families somehow a lot more important and needing to be recorded, whereas the other tenants and McNabs themselves weren't? So it's a bit of a head scratcher for me. Maybe someone in the audience has some insight into that. I would be happy to chat about it. From the period after the death of Peter II, we have two significant maps from the Royal Engineers, one showing the south end of the island and the other the central portion around McNab's Cove. This is A87 Halifax Harbor McNab Island, which shows the southern part of the island in a fair bit of topographic detail. Again, it's maybe hard to see on the slide, but there's incredible detail in the topography on this map. But like the Toller map, only includes some of the tenant names. They have a few structures and some tenant names, but not all of them. And I also say that this is a huge map that I took photographs of and had them stitched together, so that's why it looks the way it does. It's not that mangled in the archives. It's just to explain a little bit about what was going on there. So while I was looking at these maps to get a sense of the development of the island and the presence of the tenants and the McNab family, what I'm not seeing when I'm looking at the maps is any signs of the distinctive field layouts that you would expect from the rural Scottish style of land use. In Scotland, farms are often laid out with the arable infield separated from the pasture, the the oat field, the less developed oat field, by a stone wall called a head dike. And it produces a very distinctive pattern on the land that none of the maps of McNabs Island seems to be showing. Certainly there are maps that show stone walls, but they're not showing that very distinctive pattern of the head dike with the infield and the pasture beyond. And the same can be said when we look at the period paintings. Again, we're seeing fields, but we're not seeing that depictions, at least, of that particular style of land use. And this is Halifax from McNabs Island from approximately 1860 to 1862. It was painted by Captain Westcote Littleton. And this is the ancestor of G.B. Lancaster, Edith Littleton, who wrote Grand Parade as well, just to make that family connection. Also, none of the island's homes that are depicted in these later paintings bear any resemblance to the traditional stone-built black houses of Peter McNab's Scottish homeland. This also, again, further refutes the likelihood that the tenants were brought directly from Scotland, although it could be argued that the native Scots adopted wood-framed houses once they came to Canada and timber was a lot more plentiful. But we're just not seeing in the maps or in the paintings anything that looks like a particularly Scottish landscape. It doesn't look like it's been modified to follow patterns that would have been present in Scotland at the time. And so what of the archaeology? This is the Archaeology Society. We should get around to that. Some archaeological work has been conducted on the island. However, it should be noted that beyond work on the various military sites, very little research has gone into this particular time period. There's not been much carried out, other than some work done under the auspices of commercial archaeology contracts, monitoring for trails, for example. So this results in a somewhat piecemeal type of information. You don't always have the work's not being done in the areas that you want to see. When I was doing this research, I had a conversation with an archaeologist who had done some monitoring quite near the McNab family homestead site where it's thought to be. And he was seeing things that he wanted to investigate that were just outside of his monitoring area, so he just couldn't do it. He couldn't look at those things, and he was quite frustrated by it. So hopefully this is something we can remedy. There is an exception, of course, the 2004 island-wide survey of archaeological features carried out by Black Spruce Heritage Services. Unfortunately, the survey itself is quite comprehensive. It's island-wide, but the individual sites receive only minimal attention. It is just a survey. Archaeologically, the island is challenging as a landscape because it has been extensively overwritten by successive periods of occupation, different owners, different uses, including the not insignificant presence of the military, particularly at Fort McNab, which is quite near the original McNab family homestead site. So taken as a whole, there is very little to support the popular vision of Peter McNab's Scottish community on McNabs Island in the available archival, cartographic, archaeological records. But it doesn't end there. We're not done. So if Peter McNab and Peter I as landholders do not appear to have been intentionally recreating aspects of Scottish social relations or tenancy on the island, to what extent did they embody Scottishness in their personal identities? After all, the fact does remain that Peter McNab was born and raised in Highland, Scotland, and it also seems that Peter sent his son to spend a significant portion of his formative years with his McNab relatives in Scotland. The Cook Castle's letter makes specific reference to the Halifax McNab's connection to the Old World McNabs based in Perthshire, particularly with the old Laird and clan chief. And this claim is supported by a series of letters written by Robert McNab to James Colquhoun regarding young Peter, Peter II. And we'll come back to this in a moment. For both Peter and his son, perhaps the most overt public expression of Scottish identity seems to be participation in the North British Society in Halifax. The North British Society was founded as a fraternal organization for Scots and their sons with the aim of supporting newly arrived countrymen and creating community for Scottish citizens of the town. Both father and son were members, with the elder McNab holding the position of moderator for 5 years. Looking particularly at Peter McNab II, we have a series of letters that offer some insight into the formation of Peter II's identity as a Scot. And as I said, these letters were written between Robert McNab to James Colquhoun, Esquire, in London, and they discuss the care and maintenance of young Peter II while in the care of his McNab relatives in Scotland. Robert McNab is identified as Captain Robert McNab of Dundurn, who is brother to the McNab clan chief Francis McNab. A telling passage gives some insight into Peter II's youthful interest in presenting a Scottish identity. The letter states, "The boy had a desire of having the Highland dress with him." And further, the letter details Peter II's purchase, including 2 tartan kilts, 1 pair of brogues, 5 pair of tartan hose, 3 yards of tartan for a kilt, 1 bonnet and ribbon, 2 pair of garters, 1 penknife. And I'm thinking that the reference to the bonnet and ribbon could be describing a Balmoral bonnet style of hat or a Glengarry style of hat, and the penknife could be the skin-dew, the knife traditionally worn in the sock. This account shows that young Peter was acquiring his Highland garb in 1778. And this is during a time when the Disarming Act, set in place after the failed Jacobite rebellion, forbade anyone not in military service from wearing Highland dress. And while enforcement of the act had relaxed by 1778 when Peter II made these purchases, the act was still technically in force, and therefore young Peter and his relatives were acting in contradiction to it. Of the more flamboyant expressions of Scottish identity described in the literary tradition, I could find no indication that either McNab, senior or junior, spoke Scottish Gaelic, or for that matter, went around the streets of Halifax in wearing traditional Highland dress, or kept a piper as a member of their households. I've also found it interesting doing this research that neither man, father or son, chose Scottish wives, or even women with the apparent social standing that would befit a self-styled laird. Remember that Peter I married Susanna Coon, who is the daughter of a tenant family, and in a similar fashion, Peter II married Joanna Culleton, daughter of another tenant family on the island. By 1847 and the death of Peter II, references to a Scottish lifestyle on the island dwindle, with little evidence that the later generations possessed a strong connection with their Perthshire relations or with forms of Scottish identity. However, the family tradition does retain a belief in the McNab's original ties to a Highland identity. The Cook Castles letter recounts a tale of Peter II's premonition about a death, and the author goes on to say that on the strength of this tale, you may claim that the Highland gift of second sight was transported to Canada. In all of this deliberation, I think it's essential to bear in mind the multifaceted and overlapping nature of identity. It's never a simple thing. It's never two-dimensional. It's never straightforward. Both men, Peter McNab and Peter II, may, indeed, at various times and in particular contexts, have considered themselves Scots. But in other situations, they may have equally been residents of the town of Halifax, well-connected businessmen, Presbyterian churchgoers, fathers, sons, husbands, or simple merchants. It's possible that Scottish identity was for them more an external presentation to a public audience, thinking about the North British Society and participation in that organization. Or it might have been an expression of family ties or nostalgia, rather than an adherence to a traditional Highland culture. One final piece of the folk tradition that I wanted to grapple with. Peter McNab is said to have purchased his island home on Christmas Day, 1782, which struck me as an odd date to make a sale. I was further perplexed when I found the deed of sale for the island between the Cornwallis family and Peter McNab, which is dated the 27th of May, 1783. So clearly not Christmas, or even Christmas time, or even 1782. This Christmas dating appears to be a relatively recent addition to the folk tradition. All references seem to point to an article from 1984 written by Sherry Aikenhead that appears, and it appears that this is the first time this date is referenced. And again, if anyone has any other information on this, I would love to talk to them. But I noted that the source of the publication for Aikenhead's article, the Commercial News, was not a local newspaper at all, but the mouthpiece of the Halifax Board of Trade. When I looked at the article itself, it was primarily about tourism on McNabs Island, with the historical component, the history of the island, being a very small actual part of the article. The author not only incorrectly states that the island was purchased on Christmas Day, 1782, but also misnames the buyer as someone named Captain John McNab and not Peter McNab at all. And we find that this date starts getting repeated from 1984 onwards. And I found it really interesting that the folk tradition of Peter McNab continues to, reproduce itself. Switching tracks a little bit here. Researchers and genealogists in the audience, I imagine there are a fair number of you, you'll know that the tradition of naming children, particularly the male children, after their parents can present some significant hurdles in archival research. In the McNab family, there are 3 Peter McNabs in 3 successive generations. As a result, primary and secondary source records are by times a little bit perplexing and a little bit unclear whether they are referencing the first Peter or his son Peter II during times when both men were conducting business in Halifax and leaving their names in the historical paper trail. A greater challenge to determining the ancestry and activities of Peter McNab and Peter II, as well as other McNab family members, is the presence of at least 2 other Peter McNabs, that's 2 more, of no direct relation to the McNabs of the island in the Halifax area during the same time period. There's just way too many Peter McNabs in colonial Halifax. A history of this other McNab family shows that another Peter McNab arrived from Scotland in 1789 with his brother Alexander. And confusingly and clearly incorrectly, this same history states that an unnamed daughter of this other McNab family married Peter McNab of McNabs Island. And that's incorrect, clearly, because we remember, and we have quite good sources that tell us that Peter I married Susanna Kuhn, and Peter II married Joanna Culleton. Upon their arrival in Halifax, Peter and Alexander reportedly stayed on McNabs Island before purchasing land in Eastern Passage, and therefore I tend to refer to them as the Eastern Passage McNabs. I found a 1789 deed that confirms the purchase of this land in Eastern Passage, as well as the presence of this separate McNab line in the area. And this deed lists the buyers as Peter and Alexander McNab, lately of Stair in Scotland. So, as I was looking at the Eastern Passage McNab line of Peter and Alexander, they appear throughout the historical record, including census records, will and probate accounts, marriage accounts. So in addition to one additional Peter McNab, this line, at least one additional Peter McNab, this line also boasts a number of John McNabs and at least one James McNab, all names that are shared with the Island McNab family. I've done my best to try and pick apart the genealogy and the family tree with some success, but it still makes for very confusing research. Taken as a whole, the body of information suggests that the Eastern Passage McNabs were likely related, if distantly, to the McNabs of the island, and that the 2 families would have interacted. Although there is no record of them intermarrying, which could suggest that they are more closely related than perhaps the information that's available would suggest. Right. So, if we aren't finding that the folk and the literary traditions are depicting an accurate representation of Peter McNab and his family, it's worth asking, where exactly did this tartan-clad vision come from in the first place? The documented activities of other Scottish McNabs may have provided inspiration for the romantic portrait we do have of the Halifax McNabs. This is Francis McNab, that somewhat infamous and decidedly flamboyant 16th chief of the clan. This larger-than-life figure was known for wearing Highland dress and living extravagantly as befitted a Highland Scottish laird. And while Francis might have been inspirational, his heir may be the actual model for Peter McNab in the folk and literary traditions. Archibald McNab, who's the 17th chief of Clan McNab, fled Scotland in 1822 in order to escape his creditors. He settled in the Ottawa Valley on a grant of land that is named for him today. Archibald is notable for a scheme to bring settlers from Scotland as indentured servants. This Scottish McNab definitely styled himself as a laird to his tenants and continued to assert a Scottish identity in the New World. His contemporaries described him as dressed always in full Highland costume, the piper going before. And as we sift through these pieces of information that I've been presenting tonight, it becomes abundantly clear that another main source for the romantic portrait of Peter McNab and Peter II is clearly the novel Hangman's Beach. Thomas Riddell's research notes for this work revealed that he relied quite heavily on the Cook Castle's letter, as well as he viewed the letters between Robert McNab and James Colquhoun regarding Peter II. And I think then very successfully embroidered a story upon these foundations. And context is incredibly important here because Riddell was researching and writing his novel during a period of history when Nova Scotia's political interests were actively creating and promoting a version of the province as particularly Scottish. This worldview, which was dubbed Tartanism by later writers, was the brainchild of a group of prominent Nova Scotians, chief amongst them Premier Angus L. MacDonald. The phenomenon of Tartanism has been called a matrix of ideas about and images of nature, history, and race, all testifying to the Scottishness of Nova Scotia. This romantic, anti-modern take on Nova Scotia's history emphasized and embellished the province's ties with the old country and fostered warm memories of gallant lairds, colorful tartans, and stout-hearted crofters. Riddell's version of Peter McNab, as well as G.B. Lancaster's Cochrane family in Grand Parade, would seem to be very much products of this tide of tartanism. Finally, as well as these various evocative sources, I think the folk tradition has been fueled and fostered by an ongoing confusion and conflation of the McNabs living on the island with their Eastern Passage relatives. Because of the two groups, the Eastern Passage McNabs, that's Peter and Alexander and their family and that whole family tree I was just showing, the Eastern Passage McNabs more fully retained their Scottish identities here in Nova Scotia. While Peter McNab of the island quickly became identified as a resident of the town, the various Eastern Passage McNabs, through property deeds as well as death certificates, continue to identify themselves and be identified by relevant authorities as Scottish. The documents will say Peter McNab of Perthshire or Alexander McNab of Stair in Scotland. While this research was completed as part of my undergraduate honors thesis, by no means do I feel that this work is completed, and indeed there are a range of possible avenues for future research into the early colonial history of the island. I do feel that future research requires framing a new question. I don't think we're any longer asking, was Peter McNab, was Peter II playing the Laird on the island? I think we're now looking at how was the island being used and occupied during the early colonial period. I believe future research would definitely be aided by a more thorough survey of the various sites around the island that were thought to be connected with the McNab period of occupation, including the area that's thought to be the original homestead site on McNab's Cove, as well as some of the potential tenant farms that have been located in the Black Spruce Archaeological Survey. Ideally, future research would also include eventual excavation around these sites. I would be interested to see further archival information, to see if further archival information could be located, possibly in Perthshire in Scotland or other archives around the UK, somewhere or somewhere else. I would be interested in seeing the other half of the correspondence between Robert McNab and James Colquhoun regarding Peter II, or perhaps even some Peter McNab's own correspondence between himself and his Perthshire relations. And I should say that in doing the original research, I did contact the Perth and Kinross archives in Scotland. Looking online, they had a wonderful selection of documents they weren't showing, but they said indicated they were about a Peter McNab of Halifax who served under Cornwallis. And I thought, oh, well, that must be my Peter, it must be him, because there's an awful lot of McNabs in Perthshire, I must say. So I sent away for it, and weeks later I got the photocopies from Perth and Kinross archives and opened my envelope very eagerly, and it was photocopies of documents from the provincial archives here in Halifax. So it's close, but not quite. I also think that it would be wonderful to see some more genealogical work being done to better situate Peter McNab within Clan McNab, within the structure of his Scottish context, and also to further tease out the two McNab lines in Nova Scotia, the Island McNabs and the Eastern Passage McNabs. And so the end of all of this is that I would definitely be interested in speaking with anyone in the audience who is enthusiastic about this research or who has information that might add to what I've been speaking about tonight. And I think there's probably a fair number of you. I'd like to conclude this talk on a personal note. After completing my BA at St. Mary's, I spent a year in Scotland, completing my master's at the University of Glasgow, where I was studying an entirely different period of Scottish history. I was looking at early medieval Scotland and Pictish stones. But ever since I completed the thesis, I never really stopped thinking about the McNabs. I've continued to research the family since I've returned to Halifax, and I will admit I have dragged family members out to look in blackfly-infested woods to search for the graves of the Eastern Passage McNabs, some of whom migrated to Malagash in northern Nova Scotia. And so perhaps I'm being haunted by the McNabs because when I was living in Glasgow, I discovered that Francis McNab, that flamboyant clan chief that both Peters would have known, was residing in portrait form at the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery, just a block from where I was living. So I had to go see him and have this lovely picture taken, which I'm not quite sure why that expression is on my face, but it's a document of the time. And I'd also like to wrap up by thanking the various people who were so instrumental to doing the original research when I was completing the honors thesis. And there's so many people to thank, but I want to particularly single out Mike Sanders, who generously shared his time and research on the island. I'd like to thank Royce Walker for his assistance, and broadly thank as well the Friends of McNabs Island, many of whom are in the audience. Thank them for all the work they do around the island. I also want to mention that because they are here, they have brought their book as well. They have brought Discover McNabs Island, which they will have for sale after the talk, and it's a very good cause, and I'm sure they would be happy to talk to people about joining their society, but you should also join the Nova Scotia Archaeology Society too. I've covered all my bases there. I also want to thank the staff at the Provincial Archives for their support and assistance and finding wayward maps and repairing broken microfilm when that happened. And I also want to thank my honors committee from way back when. I want to thank Jonathan Fowler and Paul Erickson and Ron McDonald. And since he's had so much of a hand in creating the romantic, if not particularly accurate, portrait of Peter McNab and his son, I thought I'd leave you tonight with some final words from Thomas Riddell and Hangman's Beach. His father, that was old Peter, this one's young Peter, though he's in his 40s now and got a boy Peter of his own. Old Peter McNab bought that there island for a hatful of gold guineas, so I've heard. Built a stone house on it and cleared most of the woods for sheep pasture. Wanted to live like a Highland lord, and so he did, with bagpipers and all the rest of it. And so does young Peter now. Thank you very much.